We all know Charlie Chaplin. His appearance, mostly in the form of his famous tramp character, is iconic. But Chaplin was more than just an on-screen clown. He set standards in the film industry and raised the bar on filmmaking techniques. But how did he do this? Let's find out. I'm going to skip over Charlie Chaplin's early life and just skim through his early film career. He made his first film appearance in 1914 for Keystone, a film company specializing in slapstick comedies. This is where he made a name for himself, kicking people, falling down, running from cops. He quickly became one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. This is where he also developed his famous tramp character, a down-on-his-luck drifter of sorts who always accidentally gets involved with incidents of romantic drama or crime. Usually well-meaning and clever, he often caused trouble wherever he went. This formulaic style stayed more or less the same for the rest of the 1910s. But things were about to start changing. Unbeknownst to many of his fans, Chaplin wanted to achieve something greater, to push past his image as a clown. He thought of himself as an artist, and he wanted to prove that he was. This change would begin in the 1920s. His first, most important achievement of the decade was his 1921 film The Kid. It was a huge success, eventually drawing in over $5 million at the box office. While Chaplin was, at this point, already an established film star, this further success solidified his new formula, though that's not to say that his new films were formulaic. Let me explain. As I said before, throughout the 1910s, Chaplin's trademark was slapstick comedy. While he was certainly inventive and creative in the way he did it, it eventually became kind of a trope, and it was more or less the same thing. And Chaplin was becoming bored with the same routine. While Chaplin had been starring and directing a majority of his films beginning in 1914, he also began producing them as well when he joined Mutual Films in 1916. Then, after joining First National in 1918, he even began composing the music. Taking on all of these roles simultaneously was unprecedented, and Chaplin was only becoming more successful and critically acclaimed. And upon the release of The Kid in 1921, the critical acclaim would skyrocket even further. But why was this? In slapstick comedy, there was some occasional drama, but it was usually absurd and not too serious. But in The Kid, we see Chaplin masterfully mixing slapstick comedy and realistic, heart-wrenching drama in a single film. First, the tramp and the kid think of money-making schemes in the beginning to get by financially. The tramp lives in a run-down house with no steady job, so with the help of the kid, he is better able to scrape by. That was the slapstick portion of the film. But the tramp doesn't just use the kid only for making more money. He truly does care for the boy, though this isn't initially addressed. Despite some contemporary critics accusing him of doing otherwise, Chaplin avoids shameless sentimentality. Instead, we see the relationship of the two characters grow in a fun-loving sort of way. But this all changes when the kid is forcefully taken away from the tramp when it is discovered that the boy is an orphan and the tramp is not his father. In this iconic scene, the tramp fights as much as he can to get the boy back, but is ultimately restrained by the other men. This is where we see his true, human feelings towards his adopted son. After a lengthy and dramatic chase, with the tramp racing across the rooftops, the two are eventually reunited. The Kid is a perfect example of what Chaplin would soon become known for. The master comedian was also able to show real human emotion, far from the over-dramatic kind in other silent films. It was relatable, it made you laugh, then cry, then laugh again. It was filmmaking genius. After this momentous film, Chaplin made a few more run-of-the-mill, though still good, comedy shorts. The Idol Class later that same year, Payday in 1922, and the more inspired The Pilgrim in 1923. But after this, Chaplin made a very important decision. Back in 1919, Chaplin, along with fellow filmmaker D.W. Griffith and the married actors Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, created their own film distribution company named United Artists. The purpose was to have more creative control over their own films and take a larger share of the profits at the same time. In 1923, Chaplin began releasing all of his own films through United Artists. This had the effect of a massive increase in space between films, though all of these films would be of immensely high quality. However, it had a rough beginning. The first film to be released in this way was A Woman of Paris in 1923. Chaplin made only a small cameo appearance, which in itself was a disappointment to many. In fact, this was the main grievance among viewers. Although the film was praised critically, it made very little impact at the box office. But on the release of his next film nearly 2 years later, Chaplin struck gold. Literally. The 1925 film Gold Rush shows Chaplin at the top of his game. This film follows a similar structure. First, we see the familiar tramp character up to his usual shenanigans, this time in the setting of the Alaskan Gold Rush. His situation with his business partner is dire, but the facetious Chaplin portrays this in a comedic fashion, an example of his masterful use of dark humor. In this famous scene, the tramp, seeing that they have no food, proceeds to casually boil and eat his own boot. Also similar to The Kid, Chaplin also includes poignant and human emotion. This is most evident in another famous scene towards the end of the movie. The tramp is all alone in his cabin, thinking about the local woman he has grown to love. He daydreams that she and her friends come to visit him, and he puts on a little show for them, using forks attached to pieces of bread to do a comic dance. While this scene is normally seen as just another of Chaplin's comedy skits when isolated, in the context of the film's story, it's a heartbreaking moment. The tramp is crushed by his own loneliness, and he can only be with the woman he loves in his own imagination. Given the nature of contemporary films at that time, using comedy to show sadness was extremely inventive and clever. The last feature Chaplin released in the 20s was The Circus in 1928. Just like in the other two films, Chaplin reprises his role as the tramp character. Here we see a similar formula as in The Gold Rush. The tramp is up to his usual tropes: bad luck, trouble with policemen, and a long chase. But after he meets his love interest, we see Chaplin's trademark of this period. The two slowly become closer, and the tramp is appalled that her father, the circus ringmaster, is so abusive and cold towards her. He secretly supplies her with food after her father forbids her to eat, and other small gestures that make his character likable and sympathetic. But later in the film, the girl falls in love with the attractive new act, a tightrope walker. It's this moment that reminds us of the tramp's loneliness in the Gold Rush. But this time it's simply being jilted, not being invisible, but both of which many people can identify with. And also like in the Gold Rush, the tramp's imagination runs wild, showing his true desires. He wants to beat up the tightrope walker and claim the girl for his own, but he doesn't. We as the audience sympathize with his plight. It's relatable and human. The Circus, unlike the last two films, adds something unique. In The Kid and the Gold Rush, the tramp has a happy ending. He is reunited with his adopted son, and then he is reunited with his love interest. But this time, we don't get that. Instead, the tramp chooses to set up the girl and the tightrope walker for marriage, for the well-being of his true love. Using past films of Chaplin and many others, we assume that something will happen, something will bring the girl back to the tramp. But Chaplin plays with our expectations. Instead, the newly married couple hops on a train without the tramp. Again, we think something will happen to make that happy ending. It must. But we wait, and nothing happens. The girl doesn't rush back to the tramp and profess her love. The tramp doesn't run after the train to profess his love. Then we see the tramp go back to where the circus had been. But now it's just the outline of a circle in the field. The circus is gone. His love interest is gone. There is nothing more to say. The tramp walks off into the distance, clearly not content with how things played out, but accepting them nonetheless. It's not a happy ending. And with this, Chaplin closed out the 1920s chapter of his career. Of course, he wasn't finished by any means. He went on to be the longest holdout for silent films. While this might be excused for The Circus, which was released on the fringe of sound film, Chaplin would release his first true sound film only in 1940. But despite his stubbornness, the continued popular and critical acclaim that he received proved that Chaplin could still captivate audiences even using an outdated format. So in this way, Chaplin kept the spirit of the 1920s alive longer than most in the film industry. The 1920s saw Chaplin at his peak. While his output had drastically decreased, the three features he did make were of the highest quality of Chaplin's films and 1920s films as a whole. The Kid, The Gold Rush, and The Circus are all available to view and download online, and of course I highly recommend to anyone watching to watch them all the way through. Then you can get caught up in the comedy and emotion that is best experienced as you get to know the characters the way Chaplin intended. And these 3 features contain some of the greatest moments of 1920s film. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something about the immense importance of Charlie Chaplin in the history of film. His films still hold up very well in the modern age, and are still not cliched despite being sampled and imitated countless times. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.